Hello and welcome to our interview with a guest from Australia. Could you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Kat Clay. I am a tabletop game writer from Melbourne, Australia. My area of expertise and my love is for Call of Cthulhu RPGs. I have written two scenarios on the Miskatonic repository, the Hammersmith Haunting, which is a Gaslight one-shot, and I have also just won a Silver Emmy for The Well of All Fear, which is a scenario for Regency Cthulhu. So I won the Silver Emmy for Best Community Content, but my game was also nominated for Best Adventure Short Form against games like Eat the Reich. So it was a pretty big honor for me to be nominated in that category.
Nice. And I am Maciej. I'm a video game designer by trade and tabletop person who talks about tabletop RPGs by hobby, and I haven't received any awards. So there's
Not
that.
yet.
A Silver Annie. They're graded in metals. I'm assuming there's a gold Annie and a bronze Annie.
Yes. No, so there's no bronze Emmy. So what happens is that the Ennies are juried, so it's actually quite difficult to get on the shortlist for the Ennies. So it's a jury decides who's on the shortlist. I think there's about five shortlisted games in each category, and then it's popular vote decides the winner in each category, and then there's a Silver Emmy for the runner-up vote. So yeah, that's
okay. Because I've also seen on your site mentions of awards you were shortlisted for. So
yeah, so I'm a fairly experienced writer, I would say. Like I've written crime and horror short stories. I actually was won several awards at in 2018 at the Scarlet Stilettos, which is Australia's top short story crime prize for women in Australia. And it's quite a decent prize pool as well. Like I won close to about $2,000 for this story. So it's not a small fry award. But I was very chuffed because I won the Kerry Greenwood Prize for Best Malice Domestic, which is if you don't know who Kerry Greenwood is, she wrote the Franny Fisher Mysteries, She's a 1920s flapper detective who wears fabulous outfits, and you might see the reconnection to why I enjoy things like Call of Cthulhu so much because it's that real historical period stuff that I very much enjoy. And yeah, I've been nominated for, I would say, every major. Actually, I think I've been nominated for every major genre fiction writing award in Australia. So the Australian Shadows for critical writing. So I've written critically on, weird fiction, cosmic horror. I have been nominated for the Aurealis Award, which is Australia's top science fiction, fantasy, and horror prize. And I've won two Ditmar Awards for my YouTube channel, where I talk about video games and game writing. And that's like I don't know if you know the Hugos, but that's kind of like the Australian version of that. It's a fan voted community award, and yeah, that actually enabled me to come to Poland recently to visit you folks and kind of experience the Polish fan scene as well. So it's kind of like it's been a really exciting journey. But yeah, I suppose more recently I've moved into tabletop games, and part of that is because I've just always loved games. I just didn't think that writing games was kind of something that would be accessible to me. So it's been a very exciting journey.
Mm-hmm. And your visit to Poland was part of a bigger trip through Europe, I believe? Or am I wrong?
Yeah, no, it was. No, you're completely right. So I was elected the Australasian fan delegate to the World Science Fiction Convention this year. So they have a thing called Fan Funds, Gone Up and Over Fan Fund, or the Going Under Fan Fund, depending on which way you're going. This is a tradition that's been happening in science fiction since the 1970s. And so basically, it alternates between sending a European person to Australia and Australasia, or sending someone from Australasia up over to the Northern Hemisphere. So this year I got to be the delegate that went to Worldcon in Glasgow, and then I went to ErasmusCon in Rotterdam, the Eurocon, and then I came to Poland because I met some through the fan community. I'd met a friend called Marcin, and then obviously got to meet some very cool game writers and just fans from Poland. So it's been an exciting trip.
Okay. So you began writing before you started playing role-playing games.
Yeah, I feel like it's an interesting kind of story, right? Because I have been playing video games since I was a little kid. So, like, I actually probably got into video games earlier than most people because I've been playing video games since I was a toddler. And part of that is because my dad was an IT manager. So we always had technology in the house. We were playing, Baldur's Gate, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, a lot of those point and click adventures, the LucasArts games. And also, there's kind of freeware edutainment games, things like Commander Keen and all sorts of things. But for me, like, I loved video games. Like, I was brought up loving video games, and it took me a very long time to understand that actually, that video games actually have come from tabletop games, because where I grew up, like, it was a very suburban area. Like, I didn't really know anyone playing tabletop games, and maybe I knew about Dungeons and Dragons peripherally, but the people who played it were primarily men and teenage boys. And like as a woman growing up in those spaces, like, I just didn't get invited to sit at the table and just come alongside and play those things. So it was only until like 2018 where I actually took a game writing course where I was like, I really actually would love to get into writing video games. And with the intention of going, well, how do I develop my skills for video game writing? And I'd be friends with this guy called Mark Morrison for a while before that through the fan community. Mark is a humble guy. He had kind of failed to mention like any of this like Call of Cthulhu things, because if you recognize the name, he was the editor for one of the great Call of Cthulhu adventures called Horror on the Orient Express. Alongside Penny Love and a lot of very famous Call of Cthulhu writers, and has also been involved with like lots of game writing. And he was teaching at this course, and so I finally kind of got a bit of background on his bio. But his lesson was the one that stuck out to me the most, which was, "Hey, do you know you can write a game on Post-it notes?" And I was like, "Sorry, what? What? You mean I don't need to hire a programmer? You mean I don't need to do any of this stuff? I just like, I can just do it myself and do a bunch of silly voices and tell people how to like narrate the game for people." Like, this just blew my mind, and this was the thing, like, I just fell in love with tabletop games from that point in. And I was kind of like really blown away by this idea. And so at the same time, a friend of mine was like, "Hey, there's this game called Call of Cthulhu. I think you would really like it." And we sit at a table and we run it. And I'm like, "Yeah, I've kind of wanted to. It sounds like a really good time." And so that's how I got into tabletop games. It wasn't actually. I don't think it's what you would expect a traditional path into games is, playing it as a teenager. It kind of feels very reversed. Like, it's like video games came first and then tabletop games. But for me, then I had all those realizations like, oh, okay, so Baldur's Gate comes from this Dungeons and Dragons thing. My brain just like had a little meltdown. And same goes for a lot of systems where I was like, oh, all this dice-based rolling and the CRPGs and the RPGs that I really enjoy playing as video games all have this basis in role-playing games. And for me, that was a big epiphany. Like, my mind exploded. And that's how I got into writing them, because I just fell in love with them. So,
So, if I understand it correctly, in many ways you got into writing tabletop role-playing games before you started playing them. Or at least you were interested in role-playing games because of writing, and then you started playing.
No, so I played quite a bit before I started. I actually wrote official games. Like, I don't think you can really write a game without playing the system you're writing for. Like, I think it was more because I'd gone to this.
There's a bunch of Polish writers who would prove you wrong.
Yeah, well, I just feel like it's I don't know. Like
I'm
I
not
feel like
saying
it
that's a
shows
good
through your
approach.
writing,
I'm just
right?
saying that some people believe they can.
I just don't want people adding me on social media like, oh, you don't know anything about the system. Like, you got this wrong. I mean, people might still do that, but at least I know what I'm talking about now. But I think for me, it was only a few years. So I didn't actually set out from that course to go, I'm going to write a tabletop game. I just was like, oh, this is really cool. I really enjoyed doing this thing that turns out it's called GMing. And then my friend at the same time was like, do you want to play this game? A different friend. And so I started playing Call of Cthulhu for several years. And then when the pandemic came around, I was like, you know what? Like, this is the time for me to expand my skills a bit more. I've always wanted to write a game. Like, I should actually go and do that and write my own scenario. And so I wrote basically a one-shot game, and using this with the Storytelling Collective course, which I do definitely recommend if you are trying to write your first tabletop. It's such a good way of getting it out the door. And I just wrote this one shot, The Hammersmith Haunting, thinking, oh yeah, my mum's going to buy like 2 copies, and it's like a bestseller on Drive-Thru RPG now. It's sold hundreds of copies. It's getting close to having sold 1,000 copies. It is, and it's a really popular game for running at conventions because it runs in about 3 hours. So yeah, I have kind of been blown away by the response to it. Like I did not expect that from my first game. It's certainly a delight.
Okay. So many questions I can ask. Okay, so I'm wondering.
Go for it.
You are writing scenarios. In Poland, at least in our community, writing scenarios is somewhat controversial. Because you can argue that if you write a scenario, then what are the players for? Are they just to witness your scenario? Is that maybe the gaming session is just you reading out the short story you have written with player participation, or the model that's been implemented in Baldur's Gate, which is the plot has been pre-written pretty much, and players just have to solve puzzles and win combat along the way to unlock more parts of a story. And it doesn't use what the medium can give us, which is a player choice, going where they want, doing what they want. Writing scenarios might seem, limiting player choice to a huge degree, or just not allowing player choice. What would you say to that?
So I'm curious. Yeah, my question to you is, like, what do your poor GMs do? Like, when they're sitting down to the table, do they just, like, have to make it up on the spot?
So it depends, of course. Many groups, many styles of play, many beliefs. But one competing playstyle are more sandbox games, when the GM would prepare a setting, a map, and would ask players, like, what do you want to do? Or you can do, I guess, improvised traditional games, which is a style that I used to run pretty often, which is, I have a bunch of ideas for an adventure, like maybe a bunch of scenes, NPCs, a setting, usually a plot hook, or I would say 1/3 or the first half of a story, maybe it would be ready. And then as for the rest, we would improvise on the spot when running a game, based on what the players did. I have my NPCs, I have my locations. I come up with more scenes as they go to tailor that towards the players, and so on. Although historically in Poland, usually the books would tell us about how we can do anything in a role-playing game. Oh, you can Also, they would often reference video games. Be like, oh, in video game, you can do what's programmed in the video game, but in a tabletop role-playing game, you can do whatever. Like, whatever the game master agrees to, you can do. But in practice, game masters often came prepared with a scenario they have written, or they have purchased and read and prepared. So game masters would be inclined to push players towards the things that are prepared in the scenario. So yeah, you can do anything, but the game master would find a way to explain that's not possible to do, or just sometimes straight say you that you just cannot do it because it's not prepared, it's not in the scenario. That would also happen, and some game masters would argue, yeah, that's good. Like the game master is not a god. He has limited time to prepare, so he prepares the scenario, and if the players don't want to engage with the scenario, then there's just some miscommunication and we're wasting our time. So yeah, the scenarios are good. But on the other hand, some people are going to say, yeah, if I'm running a scenario, let's just have a writing club and have one person write a short story every week and just read it out to others, and that will be it. So
I think if I can butt in there, I think for me there's a few questions that raise us, right? So like I think one thing that I always keep in mind when I'm writing scenario, we're looking at collaborative storytelling. So I'm not just dictating a story to you as the GM or the keeper. I'm not just telling you, oh, this is how the story will go. I'm presenting you with a scenario, and then it's up to the players in their characters to respond to that scenario. Every single time I've run the Hammersmith Haunting, the responses have been different. You know, there's some people who have taken pitchforks and torches down the street with all the villagers, sort of thing, to confront someone. There's other people who have done it through more subtle means by persuading this person to give things up. There's other people who have taken the violent route. Like every single time I've run it, it's been completely different, despite being the structure of the stories is fairly similar every time. Like I'm trying to get them to an endpoint without railroading them. And especially because it is a convention scenario, I think in a convention setting, you have a much more accepted set of limitations on how you're going to run their game, because I think people are more willing to be a little railroaded in that sense because you've got a very limited time set. I think for me too, it's kind of like providing that player agency. I mean, I don't want it to feel like I'm reading your story. I'm setting the atmosphere. I'm setting you up in a situation. It's your choice how to respond to that. And I'm certainly going to give the player agency while facilitating themselves with some limitations to what they're actually going to be doing. I think too that people crave story, right? I don't think that everyone's a natural improviser. I don't think that every player that sits down to your table is actually someone who's going to be like so creative that they're going to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to improv this whole scenario and create this whole thing with you. Some people want to come to the table. They want to investigate a scenario. They want, especially with Call of Cthulhu, you know, a lot of it is story-based. A lot of it is investigative. Mm-hmm. You know, you've got people engaging with it in that way. And the other thing I will say is that giving a framework for a story and preparing a narrative that people can explore, that's one way to give meaning at the table, because like those kind of structures actually tap into kind of some of those universal storytelling structures that mean that you're going to have, like, in a good scenario, you're going to have an escalation of conflict. You're going to have a meaningful resolution. If your players kind of generally follow along with that story, that would be my goal as a writer, is that I'm going to escalate this story for them. I'm going to give them lots of options, lots of choices. But at the same time, I want to create a meaningful story and a meaningful experience for the players. So I want them to leave the table having had a memorable experience. And I think that's harder to do. I mean, it's not that you can't do it in an improvised setting, but it is harder to do without leaning on story structures and story narratives. I think for me, with the Well of All Fear, like the Hammersmith is very much meant to be more of a linear scenario. It's small. It's a one shot. It's designed to be played in a short space of time. But with the Well of All Fear, I did want to make it sandboxy at the start. So it is a sandbox environment in that there's a lot of places that you can go and find clues and investigate the mystery that you've been given. I also think a written scenario gives time poor GMs like a little bit of a mental break, right? Because that's a lot of mental load for someone to come to your table, to be prepared, to be ready to run a game, to be able to facilitate the dynamic at a table, but then to also come up with a story on the fly. That's actually very challenging. Like, not everyone can do that. But also just that whole idea of player motivation, right? Because your players are sitting at the table and they want to have a good reason to be there and a good reason to follow the threads of a story, right? So having a pre-written scenario kind of gives you at least that motivation for being there. So like in the case of the Will of All Fear, the first thing that happens is that one of the characters says, you know, hey, my brother is missing. If I can't find him, I'm going to lose my inheritance to the house and going to be an impoverished woman. Can you please help me find him before he turns up dead? And so that is immediately the investigators and the players at the table like, oh, I've got a purpose here. Like, I've got a reason for being here at the table. And so I think that I still am in favor of writing things, and I suspect too that like you said at the end of your comment is that, you know, as much as we like to imagine that GMs come to the table and they're ready to improv, they probably do have structures in their mind that they haven't told you that they're probably trying to funnel you towards. So it's kind of like, I think it's a little bit of a, yeah, I would be surprised if people are just completely making it up on the table.
Yeah, for sure. The way I run games, or I've been running games recently, is actually structured improvisation. I have learned a bunch about story structures a couple of years ago. And so for sure what I've been trying to do, and successfully too, it's not exactly easy, but for sure it's possible, that I do improvise the story, but I have a general idea of where I am in the structure, so what I need to do dramatically. So for example, I'm in the third act out of 4, and I need to escalate toward a conflict, because if I don't, then we cannot go into the 4th act dramatically, so whatever happens in the story, it won't be satisfying emotionally. So for sure that can be done because I've done it, but again, yeah, I wouldn't recommend it for a first-time GM. But you've mentioned so many topics. Okay, so let me give you an example. Because the issue with hooks, I think what you've mentioned about giving the players motivation to participate in a story, in an event, I could very much argue the opposite for the scenarios. So, what if players don't buy into the hook you've given them? So, for example, the Call of Cthulhu story you've mentioned. Let's say players decide this is not something we want to risk. Yeah, your like inheritance, other issues. Like, yes, but we don't want to risk it. Like, what then? There was this semi-famous famous situation in Poland. One game master was giving out advice on the internet based on the listeners' questions, and so the scenario. This is a Warhammer story, Warhammer Fantasy, a Polish staple, and I think there was an NPC that brought a list from the Baroness, saying, "Oh, the Baroness has send you this letter," or maybe they killed some bandits and found the letter to the Baroness, whatever. The players decided not to pursue, meaning like, oh, we are not interested, because last session we played, we also got a letter and we ended up being betrayed and didn't get a reward. So, yeah, thanks, no thanks. This time, yeah, give Baroness or, say hi to the Baroness from us, but we're not participating in this. Which was a logical decision based on the characters. It made sense from the story's perspective. I guess maybe the context was missing in the example, but perhaps it made sense from the player's perspective, because if the last time they were cheated out of a reward, then why would they participate? And the game master, I think the game master who was running the show recommended that, yeah, you should. Yeah, I said to my players, okay, that's it. like we're not playing today, apparently. I have prepared a scenario. If you don't want to engage, then that's it. And maybe let's agree better what you want to play next time. So what would you say to that? Or to a general issue, because maybe not this specific example of, this one is somewhat interesting as well, but to a more general thing, like what if players don't buy into the hook you've given them in a scenario? Is it just a requirement that players are always motivated because we have agreed that they will be motivated towards these hooks I've given them? Or the players might just force themselves, like, yeah, I'm not really interested, this doesn't really make sense, but if I don't do it, the scenario doesn't happen, so I have to do it. So, like, you're guaranteed engagement, but at what cost?
I think that's a very good question, right? Because it's like, well, you've got to make the stakes high enough for your players so that they almost feel like compelled to investigate. I think there's one of the things is an element of curiosity. It's kind of like, well, where's the brother? Like, why? Where has he actually gone? Like, I'm kind of curious. I want to know. Like, and so I think if you're just giving them a monster of the week scenario, then that's kind of like, oh well, you know, why should we care, right? In the case of I'll just talk from my own example. It's, you know, she's in a desperate situation. So one, if the players turn their back on her, she is going to essentially become destitute, fall on the mercy of society. She's a friend of yours, so you've established that, and you're doing a favor for her. So there's some real motivational psychology at work in that particular scenario, because it's like there's a curiosity factor, but there's also like a social pressure factor. Say you've got 3 or 4 people sitting around a table. It's very rare that you would find 4 people who would all agree, oh, I'm sorry, you're our fictitious friend who is desperately in need of help and will be destitute if we don't help you. I'm sorry, but we're just too busy. We're going to like go and do something else and just do some sightseeing, right? I think it's also too like how your players come to the table is important. I think in the case of all the scenarios I've run, they've either been like one shots or like longer scenarios that are not part of a large campaign. So say you're sitting down every single week for the last 6 years with the same people and you're running an ongoing campaign with the same characters, and you've got to come up with like little interstitials that happen every single week. I think that's a very different situation to someone who sits down and says, hey, I'm going to play Master of Nyarlathotep and we're going to commit to doing the campaign. And that's a very different mental attitude to someone who's just playing like a regular game with pals. Then you know, there's a real commitment to I think the campaign that you already have done in that kind of pre-work. But yeah, I think it's important for writers and for GMs to sit down and think about, yeah, actually, how am I going to make this irresistible to a player? You know, and so can there be more work done to be like, hey, well, there's actually this mysterious artifact that is rumored to, I don't know, like change the appearance of the person who wields it, and then or there's a promise of some very juicy loot or a very interesting NPC or some sort of hint of mystery that they're going to hook onto and go, hey, I can't kind of resist this. Like you have to make it irresistible, right? So it's just I think really like trying to make it original and trying to make it irresistible.
Mm-hmm. Do you do session 0? In Australia general, or you specifically?
Yeah. I don't do session 0, but that's because the people I play with, I have been playing with for 6 or 7 years. So we have already kind of established, we were already really good friends beforehand. We all know each other very well. I think when I've done actual plays with people I haven't played with before, we've certainly had a conversation beforehand, before the AP, to say, hey, here are the lines that I won't cross and things that I would prefer to be discussed under veils. I think that is very valuable, especially if you're doing a public-facing performance and you don't necessarily want to stop the gameplay and say, hey, I'm going to do that. I have personally used the X card myself. Like I've said, no, I can't continue with that line of reasoning. I think the X card is a very valuable tool. So yeah, look, I do think safety tools are important at the table, but I think it's kind of having an awareness of who you're playing with and what and how well you know them, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I think generally safety tools are more valuable with people you know less well. But the people that I generally regularly play with, um, you know, there's been times where we've had to have conversations about things that have happened at the table, but we've just had those conversations without having to go, oh, we're just about to apply a safety rule, because we are good friends who respect each other, and we're going to
Mm-hmm.
have those conversations, you know,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
if there's something that's troubling at the table.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever talked about the story of a game during session zero? Because you mentioned safety tools, which is one thing you can do with session zero, but so I've seen it with just people doing it out of their experience, and I have also seen games that either suggest it or games that have it as part of a play process. That it's just session zero is just the first session you do, which is structured, has rules, and so on. So, for example, I imagine this: you sit down with your friends, or maybe with some people you don't know, and you say, "Okay, this is a scenario that starts with player characters helping this character because of inheritance issues and other troubles that she's in. Create characters that would be willing to do that." So, for example, I might create a brother of that character. I might create her childhood friend who will for sure be interested. Maybe I would create a character that's also part of the inheritance and will for sure do it. So this way, like then we would start the game already with characters that we know are bought in, because this is something we have agreed upon. Basically, the first plot point, the heroes engaging with a story. This is agreed upon, so we're sure that we're doing it. Although some people argue that at this point, for the at least first act of the story, you're not really making decisions, you're just acting out things you have decided before. So yeah, it's not uncontroversial.
I mean, I'm curious about that last comment, because like, how can you act out decisions you've made before when you don't know what's going to happen?
Yeah, but we can already agree that we will agree to help the character with the inheritance issue.
See, this is the thing, is that like when someone sits down at my table, they don't know that that's what's going to happen. So like, you know, I often am giving pre-gens, and the pre-gens in my games are designed to be like,
okay,
enjoyable in the situation, but not necessarily linked into it. But you know, that's part of the surprise and delight of the table, right? And I don't necessarily want to take away from that. If I was doing like a safety tools check, I've used the kind of, I think Monty Cook has like a traffic light system sheet, which is more broad. I think it's more helpful to have a broader understanding of, say, what are the things that your players don't like, rather than saying, hey, this story is going to cover X, Y, and Z. If you have that sheet and kind of the general idea of like where the lines are for your friends and your players, I think that's the thing I don't want to start doing is like, here's the entire plot of the story, and I just want to check you're going to be okay with that, because part of the delight of being a player is having surprise at the table. It's knowing not knowing where the story is going to go and being surprised by that. And as a player, I wouldn't want someone to sit down and say, hey, this story, I think generally, like, hey, if something came up on those sheets and said, hey, I think there's a crossover between this area that you find particularly tricky, and you know, this area, you know, that like this might be a crossover for you, having that conversation is important. But if you can't see any issues there, I feel like you can probably, you know, depending on your players, run that. Yeah, I would err on not giving away the story in a session zero, but being more general about lines and themes that are discomforting for the players.
Although you could argue just the first act. So for sure, whatever happens next is gonna be a surprise. But for the first act, up until agreeing to help her, you know, the hero departing from the village, before or after the mentor, whatever. But so up until this point, we agree on the major plot points. So we might play introductory scenes, introducing the characters, slices of life scenes. But if the important NPC comes, we already know what the characters would have to do. So at this point, we're not making decisions. We're adding color to the scene. We're adding context, what exactly has happened, and so on and so on. But as a player, I have a little bit of a game master in me that tells me, yeah, this is what's supposed to happen. Like, we do it for the audience in many ways. But after the first act, then it's unknown. Then it's, let's be surprised and so on. So, again, that's not a style I tend to play, but I know some people that do. I know some people that they talk about so much, and they plan almost like character arcs. They tend to plan the first half of a character arc, or more, or they add so much themes and character questions and character arcs that in the final game it seems like they side about 20%, just 80% is maybe they don't make specific decisions, but if you create a character that's bent on revenge for the death of his father, and like revenge, all the things connected to the revenge of the father, you might be if it's a one shot, you might be pretty sure the murderer of your father will appear in the story. And at this point, I guess you're either gonna kill the murderer or forgive them, because those type of stories usually go with it.
This is the wonder of tabletop, right? Because the dice rolls are the thing that determine these kind of responses sometimes, right? And so you might have like written in your head this huge character arc for your character and said, yes, I'm starting off, I'm seeking revenge for my father. I'm going to do this. I'm going to like make sure I hit these key plot points. But then all of a sudden you fail your dice roll on your combat, or this happens, or the NPC responds in an unexpected way. Like, actually, I had to kill him because they were going to kill my family if I didn't. Like, and puts you in a moral quandary. And I think that's one of the reasons I love playing Call of Cthulhu so much, is because there's reasons for why these things are the way they are. But also, like, I mean, for example, I've been playing Horror on the Orient Express. I went in with a specific character that I started with, and she's not the same person towards the end of the campaign, right? But that character arc has been determined by the events that have happened to her. It's not actually, I haven't gone in with a preset agenda. And I personally, unless you're doing something performative with the intention of, hey, we'd like to, this is the general character arc we'd like to follow, I actually think it's good to go in being more flexible. And I think tabletops in generally like have made me less rigid as a person and more flexible as a storyteller, because the dice begin to tell a story that you didn't know was going to happen. We've had a really powerful moment in our campaign on Orient Express where one of my friends who I've been playing with a long time, his character was going to sacrifice his life in order that myself and another player could get away. Because we were facing an insurmountable terror. Do you know what happened? Big Bad rolled 100. He rolled 1. And he rolled 2 extreme successes in a row while punching the mythos in the face, while the mythos fumbled. I literally was crying because I'm like, oh my God, this guy's going to die. Like, we're getting away. And like, as a player, I was having a really emotional moment. And these dice rolls happen. And we're just like, we never expected that to happen. He's still with us, but we had this incredible moment of storytelling, and that's simply because the dice rolled the story that way. And that's one of the things I love about it, is that it's just, you can have all these set preconceived notions in your head, but if you roll a 1 or a 20 or a 1 and 99, like, that's going to send the story in a direction you didn't even know was going to happen, and can be quite magical sometimes, I think.
Okay. Have you played the so-called story games? Or heard about them? So, for example, games like Apocalypse World by Vincent and Maggie Baker, or Brindlewood Bay by Jason Cordova, I think? I will stop quoting the names of the authors because I don't remember all of them. but Apocalypse World, Brindlewood Bay, trophy games like Trophy Dark, Trophy Gold, and so on. A genre of games that, for example, where prep is impossible. Because in a game like Call of Cthulhu, the amount of prep you do is a matter of preference in many ways. But in games like Brindlewood Bay, prep is pretty much impossible. Have you played any of those good games?
No, I actually haven't. And I think this is one of the things that I've been, because I feel like I'm still catching up on tabletop, right? And so I've been playing a lot of different systems where I can, because like I said, I didn't grow up playing tabletop games. I feel like I have often got a bit of a backlog of knowledge that I've got to catch up on. Certainly my focus of things on Call of Cthulhu, I'm reading a lot of Pendragon at the moment. I would love to do some more Pendragon. I probably prefer a mix. I think I would very much enjoy the storytelling games. I was reading Weird Science magazine recently and looking at the Campfire game storytelling system, which sounded fantastic, about kind of telling spooky stories around the campfire. I think for me, it's just trying to find the time to explore all of these while kind of meeting my writing commitments, which are quite big at the moment. I've got quite a lot of writing gigs at the moment, so it's like a good problem to have. I think I am more personally attracted to historical period setting with storytelling elements and some combat. I'm definitely not going to be on the other side of the spectrum on the kind of, I feel like the really crunchy combat, the RPGs.
Yeah, the
so
Pathfinders
I feel like,
and whatnot. Dungeons and Dragons, of course.
The Pathfinder, I feel like Pathfinder, I play Dungeons and Dragons, but I feel like that's probably the borderline of like where I'm going to go with combat games. I much prefer that to be managed in a video game setting, because I feel like as soon as you start doing too much maths at the table, it's like it slows the game down and it gets boring.
Yeah.
I want a balance there. Yeah.
I wonder, okay, if there's a bunch of games I would recommend you that I think you might really like, either because you're gonna just like them and maybe play them, or either for inspiration or just knowing what's out there, I think I would recommend The Between or Brindlewood Bay. Brindlewood Bay is I think it's more established game right now, so there's a proof of success. The Between, I think, is less known, but some people argue that it's doing what Brindlewood Bay is doing, but better. So, like, I wonder what your reaction to those games would be. It's the games like, I think, like, they did the most, they revolutionized the most, like, they went the farthest with the formula. So those are investigation mystery games where even the game master doesn't know what happened, doesn't know the reveal, the mystery. It's a game that's run entirely by structure, that usually players are more, they're not game masters, but they're more involved with collaboratively designing what's gonna happen. Like, you collaboratively talk about what scene is gonna happen next, what would make sense to happen next, and yeah, they think they did with mysteries, because how do you do a mystery that's not pre-written? Because it has to make sense, right? It has to be logical. Player would have to be able to deduce stuff, so it has to make sense. Turns out it doesn't. Like, not all players love it, of course, but it's possible. So, I think.
Well, it's interesting to say that. I mean, I've read a little bit about, so like I'm familiar with kind of the concept for that. But coming from a crime writing background, right? This is one of the things that actually I do think about a lot. Is that when I'm writing a crime story, a crime novel, crime short story, part of it is leaving the mystery open enough so that multiple people could have committed the crime, right? Because you want the player or the reader to keep guessing about who the person who did it is. And so that actually tracks in my mind, that makes sense, because leaving it open enough that there could be multiple culprits is actually a good storytelling device, and it makes the mystery more interesting and more compelling, because you're going to be guessing till the very end. You don't want it to end up being like, oh, it's that guy who we saw in episode 1 who just looked a bit creepy and was like photocopying too many pages of like
Yeah.
the wanted ads, or was lurking around the side of the crime scene, we've all been there watching a crime show going like, oh yeah, I knew it was him from like day one, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that structure is interesting to me. And I think too, like I've looked at the gumshoe system as well, the Trail of Cthulhu kind of stuff. And I think that has some very good advice for writing investigative, like those kinds of storytelling mysteries.
Yeah, I've run like
So yeah,
a year ago. I've run a Trail of Cthulhu game. Funny enough, you were talking about scenarios before. The scenarios making it easier for the game master to run a game. I wanted to run a scenario, like the scenario from the rulebook. I wasn't able to. I started to ring it, and I decided like it doesn't have enough. It gives me like vague ideas I would have to do, but I reckon that I would have to pretty much memorize it to be able to like not to change the story in a meaningful way. Because especially in an investigation, what if I improvise some scene that breaks up a scene that happens further because maybe this clue was important and this one wasn't? Yeah, I decided it's going to be easier to improvise rather than run the scenario. Because, reading the scenario and learning it and making notes takes time. And I can improvise whatever. So I remember, but it doesn't have to do anything specifically with Call of Cthulhu. It's more of a general...
Yeah, no, I think it's helpful for players to know, like, especially if you're a keeper writing a scenario, that one of the things I do is that I just, at the end of each section, like before players move on, I just do a few dot points of like what the players should know by now, and what they might know.
Okay.
And so for the keeper, then for them to be able, for them to go, hey, actually, my players know this, and this, then we can move on to the next section. Then that's not a problem if you found out from NPC that you've made up, and that they found it out in a completely different section. As long as they hit these kind of key markers, the story can really progress. I think that's the thing for me, is that, it's giving a little bit more flexibility there on the investigative side.
So if I was hell-bent on improvising as much as possible, and if I would run your scenario, could I just take those summaries at the beginning of each section, forget about all the content, and just improvise my own content as long as it fits the bottlenecks of what they should know and what they could know? Will it be possible? I'm not saying that's the good way to run your scenarios, but just wondering about what's the... where does the structure and general narrative themes and structure, how does it meet with content specific things that happen?
I think it's a bit of a clash of conflict of like ambition with what I want to achieve with my games, and kind of like how the keeper would take and play it, right? Because if you're going to improvise everything, then why bother running a scenario that's already pre-written, right? I think too, for me, like this taps into something that I wanted to chat about that you'd mentioned earlier, which is this idea of like, we're just all kind of getting scene flavor in the first act. For me, I don't put anything in a game that is not meaningful to the story. And so my first act is not color. It's not like, oh, you're just going to the local inn and kind of meeting a few quirky NPCs. Everything in there is there for a reason to tell a story that has and a particular goal. And the goal for me was to write a feminist Call of Cthulhu scenario. And so all of the NPCs in there, if you're an experienced keeper or Call of Cthulhu player, you will go into it and be like, oh yeah, I know how this works out. And that is not how it works out, because everyone is looking at I was very clearly looking at the reversal of archetypes in it. And how you expect certain people to behave is not actually how they are. And I think for me, like, and look, that might mean that like my games are not for you, and that's totally fine. But when I write a game, I want to create a meaningful experience for the players and for the keeper. And I want it to be fun, but I also want there to be purpose and intention with all the things that I put in there. And I think that just comes from maybe a bit more experience in the writing scene, which is, there is absolutely nothing that should go into a story that doesn't serve the purpose of the story. You just don't put filler things in. You don't put like, random because they're kind of cool or fun. It actually has to serve the moral arc of the story and the story that you're trying to tell. So yeah, that's very important to me. So yeah, look, you could go in, you could improv, you could use it as a sandbox. That's perfectly fine. But I feel like maybe the meaning and the experience that the players will have is probably diminished because, you know, the story kind of that I'd intended to tell might not actually arrive. So it's kind of like, why would you run it if you're just going to make the whole thing up?
Okay.
Yeah.
Just for clarity, I'm not saying scenarios are wrong. Even like if that's the vibe I give, that's I'm kind of playing devil's advocate for many of those. So for sure, just to make sure.
I don't get that. Like, but it's yeah. Yeah, no, I understand that. It's kind of more like I feel like you're being a bit devil's advocate, right? Like I don't think that you're, you know, and the other thing is like I'm cool. If people don't want to play my game or it's not for them, then that's fine. Like not everything's for everybody, right? If you want to like if you're an improv guy and you want to run like scenarios on the fly, then more power to you. Enjoy yourself. Go have fun at the table. Like I think that's the thing is that I don't know. I think games more broadly, there's an expectation that everything has to be for everyone. And I don't think that's ever going to be true. And I find it very strange when people get on the internet and get very grumpy about, oh, I don't like X, Y, and Z. And, you know, why would I want to play this game? I'm like, well don't.
Yeah. That's what
things you enjoy.
Yeah, that's why I like the cultures of play model. Because from my experience, this one has done the most to help articulate different things we want out of games. So in some ways it has helped us in a part of a community to end the discussion that's been going on since forever, which is like role-playing or rolling dice. And yeah, it has helped us to understand what, you know, just to name what are different coherent styles of play that are perfectly acceptable and that you might try to improve within the expectations and goals of that style, rather than constantly trying to convince players to play differently and to try achieve different things out of the game. Because, you know, in a sandbox, if your goal is to get enough gold to build the wizard's tower, that's very much different than I want to experience complete narrative structure and have emotions derived from drama that happens on the game because of plot twists and whatnot. So there's that.
I think my question there too, right, is like, and this is maybe why I kind of sometimes like I bounce a little bit off Dungeons and Dragons storytelling, right? Is like the question for me is, why am I building the Wizard's Tower? It's not I want to get 1,000 gold. I need a purpose and intention for like there needs to be a reason for me to want to build that tower, right? And so it's kind of like just questing for questing's sake. I don't think is actually a fun experience. Some people really love it though, like, but I'm just a pain who always asks why.
Yeah, I think one of the things that helped me understand the difference is that so there are ways to play games, including Dungeons and Dragons, that are very much player focused, not character focused, player focused. So what does my character want? It does not matter. I'm in the game for myself. I want to see a cool wizard tower. I want to beat this dungeon. Yeah, I don't care why my character is there, why he needs the gold. I need the gold for the wizard tower and to win the game, to get to the max level and win the game. And that's for me. And that's for sure. That's a valid way to play the games. We play board games often this way. Not always. There are some games with a lot of plot and that blur the line between board games and role-playing games. But like, it's a valid style to play. But for sure, it's very much incompatible with players who want to have in-game reason for everything and they want everything to make sense. And they spend time on story scenes, developing the story well. From the, goal-minded player's perspective, like, the story does not bring me closer to getting the gold. So, like, why do we bother? You could do this with Call of Cthulhu. Like, solving the investigation might be my goal as a player. My character is just a tool I use to get the information. But in the end, it's about me solving the scenario. I did solve the mystery. I did defeat the mythos, maybe. And so on. Like, my character...
No, you never defeat the mythos.
you can in Pulp Cthulhu.
Systems, right? You can in Pulp Cthulhu, right? And I mean, there's a question there to be asked is like, can you ever win at tabletop, right? Is there a winning state? Because it's like, well, what constitutes winning in a tabletop game? Is it you've achieved your goals, you've saved people from the big bad? In Call of Cthulhu, that's very different, right? Because, a lot of you are weak human beings against the mythos, and a lot of it is averting disaster, even if you won't be known, even if you will never be famous, even if you give everything, including your life and your soul and your sanity. You might end the scenario raving mad in a lunatic asylum, but at least you know that, maybe Cthulhu didn't wake up this time and the world rests easy, at least for another decade. That's why I like it so much, because I may be less enamored of kind of heroic archetypes and heroic storytelling.
Well, this is actually what a player-focused lens explains pretty well. Like, your character has lost. They lost sanity, they died, maybe. But you as a player, if you have fulfilled the convention of Call of Cthulhu, you have told a story about fighting the unspeakable or delaying the unspeakable, just coming into contact with unspeakable and facing the consequences. You have fulfilled that story, that theme. You have won. Maybe if you have told the greatest story ever, you have won. If you have experienced a great story, you have won. Like, your character, does it really matter? So you could argue that.
I mean, that's the thing. Your character often, and like so many characters die, right? I mean, we kind of play a bit of mix of Pulp and Cthulhu. Like, I think a lot of tables actually play a kind of like half-half, like a 70 and Pulp version, because, playing straight 7th edition Call of Cthulhu is kind of deadly, especially if you're doing the big campaigns.
Yeah.
You're like, where's my 10 backup characters, because we're going to die. And, that's dice roll dependent, but 3 bad dice rolls and you're done. I think it's a good point, right? Because it's like, for me, my goal in playing a tabletop, I want to experience a good story. I want to have a meaningful experience with my friends. Someone else might come to the table and be like, I just want to beat up some kobolds and get some treasure and have a fun time and maybe eat some popcorn and have some snacks with mates,
Yeah.
And I feel like both approaches are valid. It's just that we have different ambitions and goals for the storytelling we experience at the table.
Mm-hmm.
But you were saying with that, cultures of play model, I think that, clearly, there obviously are different archetypes and different ways that people come to the table.
Mm-hmm. I don't remember which Call of Cthulhu, which Lovecraftian game was it. I remember what one game had rules for fighting the mythos was you die. That's it. There's no die rolls. There's no absurd stats for the mythos. No, you die. Always. Which is pretty smart, I believe. There were only rules for human-to-human combat. Mythos, you die.
There's rules, the sanity rules in Cthulhu, right? And it's like, well, the sanity rules for witnessing Cthulhu himself is you either lose I think it's I think it's more than a 1d10. If you fail your SAN roll, I mean, if you pass your SAN roll, I think it's a 1d10. But if you fail your SAN roll, it's a 1d100, right? Because it's like Cthulhu. You're seeing the non-Euclidean angles at all places. And I like that because there's no way, there's there's no way you're not going almost permanently insane on a 1d100 sanity roll, right? It's just and I guess that scale of scale of mechanics on the scope of what you're witnessing is quite fun.
Yeah. Let me come back to this to scenarios you've written. So I was wondering, okay, so the pitchforks bit. You mentioned that maybe players gather the townfolk and they grab pitchforks and torches and just go towards the mythos or whoever, towards the cultists. I'm assuming this example, okay, is it in your scenario? Is there if players gather the townsfolk, those are the stats of the townsfolk, this is what will happen, the next scene happens here and so on? Or because you have mentioned that you have, whenever you've run an adventure, it ends up differently. Different things happen, players do different things. But do you have those pre-planned in the scenario as options? or did you improvise and did you change the scenario? Like, what would you?
I think your video might be breaking up a little bit, so I'm not sure if it's
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
having...
Also, there's a delay. So just to reiterate my question, you mentioned before, it seems that you do improvise when you run your games. You do change the scenario. You do introduce new ways to approach issues. Do you introduce new scenes when you run your scenarios? Like, do you change them on the fly?
I think like for most writers, right, you're thinking when you write a scenario, you're like, well, what are the most logical outcomes here for this scenario? Like, what are the most logical choices or approaches that players would take, and try to cover the breadth of those. But you're not going to get all of them in a scenario, right? Because everyone is so uniquely different, and creative, that everyone's going to have a different approach. So of course, that's part of being a keeper, right? Is improvising. It's not that you want to completely railroad and make everyone feel like, oh, I'm sorry, but you can't do that because I need you to get to this point. I think it's, utilizing and reacting in that collaborative moment, right? Because you're telling a collaborative story. It's not just I'm telling you a story. We're working together to tell a story. Is I'm thinking, okay, well, you're going to take that approach to it. How do I link this into the broader story? How do I get you the information that I think you need to have while kind of leaning into what you're trying to do here? So, some people have leaned into a more mystical character where they're trying to pass the supernatural environment. And I'm like, okay, let's roll with that. Let's say, okay, well, you've rolled a hard success. You actually know that this is a mythos thing. And how can we increase the tension here because of that knowledge? How can we increase the atmosphere of the scenario? But yeah, look, I mean, I've hardly been in a place where the characters have taken it so far out of the realm of possibility. One of the things with the Hammersmith, I think it's also very good to think about, if you're writing scenarios, that limiting mechanic, right? So how are you going to limit the scope of the game? And part of that is, having the players acknowledge we've come together to play a one-shot, so there'll be limited scope, right? But in Hammersmith, there's a fog limitation. So you get into town, you can't leave because this oppressive fog has come over the town. And if you try to go out the way you came in, you get turned around in the fog and you end up back where you are. So it's kind of there's an incentive to solve that problem because the fog's not going to lift until you've solved the problem. With the Well of All Fear, the limit is that we want to investigate this crime. It's not that you couldn't just hop in a carriage and head down to London and do something completely different. But I think once the players have gone, I am committing to solving this crime, they're likely to see it through. But I also think, too, that there's some really powerful discussions to be had in character along the way, how committed am I to doing this? Where is my line? Am I going to give my life for this? And that's part of the moral greyness that I think actually comes into that scenario. And I've written that in intentionally. There's really challenging moments for players to say, hey, do I want to actually do this, or do I want to approach it a different way? Do I want to engage with the villains themselves and join their side of the thing? I think in other things that I've written, I've got a scenario coming up in the Cthulhu Invictus book that's coming out next year. I've written it.
Is it the one, the Roman Empire against the Mythos?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yeah, it's really fun to play. I just love it because you like swords and sandals, gladiators against the Mythos. I mean, how cool is that, right? It just fits so well. But I've said that at the Villa of Hadrian, and essentially an event happens that there's a security lockdown at the villa. You can't leave until this crime is solved. And so having those limitations that make sense within the context of the story, not you can't leave because I say so. No, you can't leave because the Roman emperor says so, and your culture means that if you defy the emperor, then you're done. That makes sense within the bounds of the scenario.
Playing the Roman Legion would... it would be very useful for game masters that wanna place limits on what players can do, for sure. Okay, so I
Yeah, like
understand.
it's great. Yeah, yeah, because you're like, oh, you're a military man. You need to obey your commander. Like, if you have to have a pretty good reason to go against your commander or the emperor himself.
Yeah, because pretty much under the penalty of death, literally. So
Yeah, yeah.
that makes sense. And you also have to report probably regularly and so on.
Yeah, you're given a mission and a campaign to do. It is a great structure for keepers because you're like, one player can take on the role of the commander, and then
Mm.
they've got to keep all their. And this happens in a couple of Cthulhu scenarios, not just Invictus. But I just was recently reading Reign of Terror. You're playing soldiers in the French military, and like you're not obeying your orders. You're booted out and like with a dishonorable discharge, or you're going to lose your income. So there's a strong motivation to follow your superior officer's orders, and even better if you make that person someone at the table so that they can be bossing everyone around, and there's a great dynamic there.
Yeah. Just, my mind went with this concept even further. Like, if you wanted to give the game master 100% control, just make player slaves. By the way, we actually do it. Like, you can play as gladiators, but this is like a glorified slave, so people are usually more okay with it. But yeah, you just have to do what you have to do. Although,
well, in Invictus, that's you can play as the infamy, which is like people who are infamous. So often, your gladiators, your courtesans, that kind of things, who are accepted members of society, but they're kind of edgy. It's kind of cool if you invited a gladiator to your party. Like, anyway.
Yeah, the gladiators. Okay, Ancient Rome. Don't get me started on Ancient Rome because it's Ancient Rome. You have mentioned crying during the game because of a drama. How did you manage to scare your players, for the players to actually be afraid or unease or like anxious during the game? Because you're writing and running Call of Cthulhu games, so the horror is there in the is forefront in its themes.
Yeah, I don't think personally. I don't think I've scared my players in the sense of I'm much more of an atmosphere person. I like to create a foreboding atmosphere that creates a memorable scenario. I think for me, I have been scared as a player. I think I've been the more terrifying is that I've been discombobulated, like disoriented playing a scenario. Probably my favorite Call of Cthulhu scenario, which is Dances of Vice, Horror and Ecstasy from the Berlin book. I just there were parts of that I got out of it because I was desperate to read it when I finished it, because I'm like, what happened? Like I was left with unanswered questions. And I think if you're running horror games, part of the thing that can be really disorienting for your players, because we have a innate human knowledge to fill in the gaps and go, I want answers to all of my questions and I want to know exactly what happened, is that things with the mythos are inexplicable and often, you don't always get satisfaction, and leaving players dissatisfied and kind of questioning like the very reality. Like I remember as a player having a very visceral reaction to one particular scenario and some of the things that happened there. And I actually was like, I think I'm kind of losing a little bit of sanity myself as a player, as a person outside of this game, not just my character, because it was so disorienting and, really, really made me start to question, like, what is actually going on here? Like, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not so much on like, I'm just going to scare you for the sake of being scared. But yeah, look, there's been some horrific elements, I would say, in games that I've played where they've been genuinely shocking.
Okay. I remember there was this one trick I managed to pull off during Call of Cthulhu game that I'm sort of proud of. Long story short, the theme of a horror was amnesia, just losing your mind. That was the one that I wanted to build unease with. I didn't go for straight horror because I think it's super hard during a tabletop setting. But unease and dread are easier to do. So the characters in this scenario were losing their minds because of mythos, and forgetting who they were and adopting new personalities and forgetting who were they before, and abandoning loved ones, for example, that they wouldn't recognize anymore. It's like dementia, except you were more coherent and you get a new personality, and this could actually happen multiple times. And the thing I did, like, from the middle of a scenario, NPCs started to calling player characters by different names. And towards the end of a scenario, I tricked players into just give me your characters sheet for a minute, and I didn't give them their character sheets back. And from that point on, NPCs would consistently refer them to, with their other new names. And the players did not solve the mystery. They just bailed from the town, and that was it. And yeah,
I love that kind of trippy kind of metagaming. Like, I kind of dig experimental stuff. I very much am like, hey, how can we increase the terror? So that sounds very cool to me. I'm curious though, like, was that the objective for them to quit the campaign? Like, was that kind of an acceptable outcome for you as the person who was running the game, that you felt satisfied that they were like they'd lost it?
It was, because for sure it did fit the Lovecraftian literature, the Lovecraftian tropes. Like, often the mysteries are not solved. Like, people lose their minds and so on. So it happened towards the end of a scenario. So, dramatic structure-wise, it was okay. They didn't run off in the middle. They did run off when the stakes were already pretty high. It made perfect sense. Made sense for the characters. Made sense dramatically. Made sense as a Lovecraftian story. So I think it was overall it was pretty. It was a success. There was a mystery to be solved. Theoretically, they could get to the bottom of things and maybe solve it, but not solving it was perfectly fine.
Yeah. And I kind of like that too, because there's been times where I think that's one of the things I do like about Cthulhu, is that you can actually play a cowardly character, right? You can play people who are like, hey, I'm out for myself, or I'm here for like a kind of, selfish reason, or I'm here for an obscure reason that I'm going to keep hidden from my other players. And I think that's more interesting to me, right? Because I don't want to just be playing heroes who just want to be good and win the day, right? I want to play people who are complex, and I like it when there's been times where I'm like, hey, this is consistent with my character to nope out and abandon the people who are going off to fight the mythos. So I'm just gonna be a coward and run away and kind of, and not help. And that makes for interesting storytelling, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it also depends on who you've sat down at the table, because I know that some people would just be like, hey, why did you do that? Why did you leave us behind? And take that personally. Whereas people who are kind of accepting, hey, we're going to play complex grey characters. I'm here for this. I'm more open to that.
Yeah. You could say this is a mismatch of expectations. Like, maybe some player went there to win the scenario, to solve the scenario. So from their perspective, running away is a dick move, basically. And maybe the other person is for role-playing the character. So it makes perfect sense. My character is a coward.
Yeah.
So I think
too, I've got so my friends have been like, oh, Kat, you need to play Dungeons and Dragons. It's the best game ever. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to play Dungeons and Dragons with you, and we're going to do this campaign. But when we're done, I'm going to show you this game called Call of Cthulhu, and we're going to play it. And I've got someone who's a very experienced tabletop. She's a GM, and she has run D&D a lot, and she's never played Cthulhu, and I can't wait to run it for her, because I'm just she's going to be like, what is this? Because I feel like she's going to come with 20 years of D&D experience, and then be like, okay, what is it? What is this? You mean people act selfishly? People lie. It's a lot darker. But I can't.
Don't they in Dungeons and Dragons? Sometimes.
Yeah.
You have the chaotic alignments, right? For a reason. I mean, you had them in the previous editions.
100%. I'm the chaotic alive. I'm 100% chaotic neutral, right, all the time. And I was like, when I was making my character for our campaign, I'm like, oh, of course I'm going to be like chaotic neutral rogue, very mysterious, taciturn person who does not like, is here for the cash. And her motivation is to kind of get Strahd, get money, and get out. And she's here with like, I'm sitting there in my first couple of sessions going like, why are we baking sweet rolls? Like, what is this? And like me personally, I'm just like, so why are we spending all this time in these inns? Like, this is just a waste of our time. But I built that into her character as well.
Okay.
And so like I think my friends' reactions to this is kind of like, oh, like this is strange to play with someone who's maybe a little bit more like less wanting to be a part of a heroic adventuring party, more interested in the gold sign. So yeah, fun.
Yeah,
Fun.
makes sense. One of the tropes, personally, that I don't hate the trope itself. I hate how popular it is, and that it's the default for many games. Is the trope of a party, actually, because in any other media, okay, so you've written books. How often do you have a party of heroes that they go everywhere together, they talk together, they like, they stick together through everything? It's pretty rare, right? And I feel like that if you get that in media, in books or movies, it feels like a role-playing game. You get like, oh, this is just a Dungeons and Dragons session turned into a book.
Yeah, and I mean, there's scenes in novels, right, that are like that. So, like China Medieval's Perdido Street Station, there's like literally a scene where they gather an adventuring party, and things go down. But I think it's done in a way that it's kind of not just like, oh, because they kind of spoil it. Most of them get deaded. But there's also the genre of lit RPGs where people are intentionally writing novels that feel like role-playing games. So that's like another field where someone sits down to read a lit RPG. They're like, I'm here to have an adventuring party and a quest. Mm-hmm. My personal take on it, I don't want to read about a heroic adventuring party, but I do love reading about a ragtag group of like thieves or like, they're going on a heist, one last heist, and it all goes wrong in a fantasy setting or a science fiction setting as well, like the crew of a ship. It makes sense in a science fiction setting, I think, sometimes more than a fantasy setting to have an adventuring party in a novel, because, on a ship's crew, you're going to need to do different roles. Yeah, that's kind of my take on it. Yeah.
Okay. But in other media, you often would get individual scenes or individual arcs. So in general, yes, there's a party, there's a crew, but there's a bunch of... There's a bunch of individual arcs. Do you do that in tabletop RPGs?
I think I would leave like individual character arcs to the players themselves. That's something I think that they should have agency over and decision over. I think that there's things that events you can have that you maybe try to shape, characters through those events, but it's up to the player to engage with that character. That's taking away a lot of player agency if I start to say, hey, this is how your character is going to act. I think it's a lot of fun when players take on their characters and decide to go, hey, this is how my character is changing through this story and has been changed. Part of that is dice rolls, succeeding, failing at things. Part of it is what they see. Like, I mean, my character changed because she got to one point and it was just like she'd finally seen too much. And even though that wasn't a sanity roll or a sanity loss, she actually passed her sanity test. For me, it felt like the natural evolution of this character, that this was one final straw where she's like seen a lot, been building up and building up and building up and seen a lot of things. And this is the thing that's kind of cracked her. And so for me in my head, like, she's just failed a larger kind of sanity role in her life. And that's changing her behavior in response to that situation that happened. And so she started off very naive in this story, and she's seen more of the world and become more experienced and realize the world isn't as wholesome and kind of like adventurous as, or like this idea that, she started off wanting adventure and she got adventure, but she didn't think that there would be consequences for her in that adventure. And so realizing that has changed her as a person. And, yeah, she's a little bit frayed at the edges now.
What about if you are writing scenarios and you do have pre-gens, right? So you have characters that are already fleshed out a bit, or like they have stats, they have a background. You could create a pre-gen that has lost her father and she wants revenge for the father. And then you know that in the middle of a scenario, the murderer of her father will come in. And maybe will have to be negotiated with because that's an important NPC that they have to get information from. You could structure an arc with this way, like you don't decide what the character would do in that situation, but you do put the pressure in the situation to confront the murderer. What do you think about that? Like, is it something you'd be okay with, or you think this is crossing the line?
No, I think that's fine, but it's like I'm never going to decide what a player does with a character. I think that's immediately taking away that agency and taking away that idea of collaborative storytelling, because it's like, oh no, I'm sorry, I didn't like that you chose to forgive your father's murderer. That's not how I wanted this story to go. That's quite a selfish, I think, way to approach the story, right? Because you're like, you need to have more flexibility about how the story will go because you're not the only one telling it. So yeah, I think it's absolutely, yes, put signposts and put foreshadowing and put these kinds of events in the story, but you absolutely do not get to choose how the dice roll, and you don't get to choose how the players respond. And that's the fun of tabletop. And maybe if you don't like those kinds of things happening, that I don't know if tabletop is for you, because they're like two of the best aspects of it is not knowing how the players will respond and how they've interpreted their characters.
Do you run branching scenarios? So like the typical things to do in a video game would be the character gets to decide whether they kill the murderer of their father, whether they take revenge, or whether they forgive, or maybe they do something in between. Let's say you do 3 options, and then you write dialogue for option A, for option B. Maybe you do a varying amount of content that depends on the decision. It's a typical thing to do in video games up until today. I think that's the main way to do computer RPGs. Do you do something like that, or did you consider doing something like that in tabletop?
Oh yeah, so I mean, like, I love branching RPGs. I mean, I love the Choices Matter RPGs. They're like my favorite video games, right? I just it's so cool for me to look at them and see, hey, if I choose this option, how does the story change? How does it play out? I think though, like, there's kind of like there's funnels. Like, you are going to have branching dialogue and branching choices in a game or in a video game, but you are still going to be funneled towards certain outcomes, right? So like, you make these choices. There's still a finite limit of outcomes, even in a video game with so many choices, right? And it's about, I think, one, especially in video games, is giving the illusion of choice. It's making players feel like they do have that agency and that the choices they have made are ones that they wanted to make, and that the outcomes are logical and kind of progress from those choices. But in tabletop, I think it's, you have to estimate what the approximate outcomes are going to be. And I mean, I always put a bunch of outcomes at the end to say, hey, if your players chose this, then then this is what the outcome is for that. If your players made this choice, then this is the outcome for that. And there's multiple things there because there's obviously multiple probabilities, right? But I've tried to cover the main bases. Humans can go and change that if they want. That's perfectly fine. But say, like, for example, like Regency Cthulhu has a reputation mechanic. You have depending on the dice rolls, your reputation, you could be like a hero of the Regency period, or you could have lost your reputation and you're going to need to leave the country because people have shunned you from society.
Mm-hmm.
And that has a mechanical outcome as well in terms of penalty and bonus dice in Regency
Okay.
Cthulhu. Um, yeah, but like for me, it's wrapping up the story in a satisfying way because of those outcomes. I don't think you should just leave their choices hanging. I think that they should have consequences. I think that should at least be wrapped up in some kind of epilogue. Even if you're continuing the story with a different kind of adventure the next week.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of cheating with dice by the game master for the sake of a story? You're towards the end of you're running a game, you're towards the end of a scenario. Things are lining up for a very engaging, interesting story, but then there is this dice roll that just messes things up, and you don't have a good idea, like you don't have a feel for how it would wrap up very nicely, and then there is this other thing that could have happened. So maybe if you just tell the players that the bad guy failed, or vice versa. Do you consider this acceptable? Assuming the game master is rolling behind the screen and can say whatever they want about the dice roll.
I feel like I would generally very much avoid fudging. I feel like there's a difference between like falsifying and fudging a dice roll in the sense of like sometimes like you want character deaths to be a meaningful death, right? So like maybe if the character is just about to die from this particular dice roll, you want to make it a meaningful kind of situation. But like I would generally not change dice rolls. I feel like they're meant to be, right? I feel like the story is told the way it's meant to. Like the dice is there to like facilitate that story, and I can't. I feel like if you're so preset in how the stories ought to go, and it hinges on like one dice roll, then there's maybe a problem with your storytelling because I can't even think of like. I think like the biggest thing for me would be combat rolls, right? Because like a lot of that's the stuff that can get deadly and very hairy. So yeah, I feel like one of the things for me too is like in Call of Cthulhu, right? You can stumble into issues where people fail dice rolls and miss clues. So one thing that's very important for me is that people are not going to miss a clue because they fail a dice roll in my games. They will just get less of the clue or less helpful information, or they'll have another consequence that's separate to obtaining the clue. Like they'll be caught getting the clue and lose reputation or that kind of thing. Like they'll have an adjacent problem as a result of a failed roll versus the whole game comes to a shuddering halt because you failed a roll. And I think that's a storytelling problem if your whole game stops because you roll a bad dice.
Yeah. But also Call of Cthulhu problem philosophically. I think like a Gumshoe has addressed this in the design itself. Like core clues you just get, and that's it. The system makes sure that's the case. I feel like you implement the greatest invention since sliced bread RPGs wise is the partial successes from my perspective. I think Powered by the Apocalypse games are at least they are responsible for popularizing it. I can hardly run games without this RPG technology. The one way to implement it is what Fate Core does, which is a failure on a check means either a failure or success at a cost. There's never a state when there's just failure. So you can always give a success with a cost. And there are others, like Powered by the Apocalypse games would give you a range. Like the check can be and result in a success, in a failure and a consequence. Something always has to happen. Or a weak hit. So a success and a consequence. You found a clue, but the police believes you're the suspect. You found a clue, but you are super tired, and so on.
Yeah, 100%. And I would agree. I would agree with that for all systems. I just think it's more. It's just it's kind of keeping the consequences adjacent to the clue. I just feel like it's too punishing to just be like, I don't know, like I remember back to playing, I think it's the Dig back in the day, right? The video game The Dig, and that was just so punishing because if you didn't find things within the time limit, the game would kind of enter this fail state of like you couldn't actually finish the game because
Was it a silent fail state?
Yeah, it was. It was.
Oh.
It wouldn't tell, and just kind of got stuck in this
The
game.
worst.
And I remember,
the worst.
yeah, and it's kind of like it didn't give you any. Maybe it did because I was quite young when I played it, but like it didn't give you an indication of there's a time limit on these things. Oh, if you don't get these clues by the end of the day, this game will kind of soft lock on you. Like, so it yeah, I don't want players to get to that point where they're boxed in a corner and you have to like throw clues at them in some other way.
Yeah, if you have to throw clues at them, but the system makes it that they can fail to get a clue, especially at no fault of their own, so just a failed dice roll. They did all the things they could do, but just that they were unlucky. It sounds like a design issue.
Yeah, I think so. I'm probably going to have to wrap up soon because
I have to as well.
I have
to go to work, actually.
It's been so much fun having this chat. I mean, like, it's been such a good conversation. So
awesome, nice to talk to you as well. So let's wrap up. So maybe closing statements. Any? Okay. So for sure. Tell us about your products, but maybe also what are you interested in lately, tabletop-wise? Like, what are you playing? What's interesting you right now?
Yeah, so what's really interesting me right now, I'm reading through Pendragon's core rulebook, and I've been playing a little bit of Pendragon at Chaosiumcon and just like doing some APs of it, and I kind of am secretly in love with it. So I am really keen to run more of that and learn it, write it, do things with it. I also am going to PAX Australia soon, so I am very keen. I'm not sure when this interview is going to go out, but in October, I think like 11th to 13th, I will be definitely keen to check out a lot of the tabletop stuff that's going on there, and the Australian role-playing community. There's a game that's coming out with Storybrewers role-playing I'm kind of very interested in called Castles in the Air, and it's a Gilded Age kind of storytelling game based on things like Little Women and Anne of Green Gables, and it just like, it's just the system itself sounds really, really amazing. I'm kind of hoping that they have some demos at PAX, because it's about kind of, setting dreams and goals for your characters, and then seeing how those differ between like childhood to adulthood, and whether you achieve them or whether you sacrifice things in order to pursue other avenues, and how they come into conflict with the other players. It just sounds like such a beautiful storytelling system, and I'm excited to check that out. Apart from that, like, again, I'm just trying to experience as many systems as I possibly can. So I've been like sticking my hand up to try anything, really. I've played homebrew stuff. I've played indie itch games that I've really enjoyed. I've played RuneQuest. Obviously been playing D&D. I am still trying to get on a vampire table. I actually feel genuinely cursed. Every time I try to play vampire, something happens. Don't get to play it. And my goal for PAX is to get on a vampire table. So
you should have been in Poland in the early 2000s. There was a lot of World of Darkness. But that's another topic we could go on and on about, and we don't have the time.
Yeah.
I do recommend from what you're saying, I would recommend either Brindlewood Bay or The Between as a game I think you should play or run if you want to see what other games are doing with the mysteries, because I think that's like, I was suspicious at first as well, but I mean, the success, you can't argue with success, I guess. So it's interesting hobby, and also interesting period of time for the hobby. I think in many ways it felt like in the 90s, like everything that the hobby was what it was, and it never is going to be anything more. Like, this is the pinnacle of role playing. And here we are in 2024, like discovering new ways to play and new mechanics and turning everything on its head.
Yeah,
it's a pretty good time to be alive, tabletop-wise, I guess.
Yeah, it is, and it's exciting for me uncovering all these things at the moment and just how open it is. So it's great.
Yeah. What are the games you've published, and where can we find them?
Yeah, so I've got 2 games out, The Hammersmith Haunting and The Well of Orpheus, which are both available on Drive-Thru RPG. You can also find them at my website. The links are there, catclay.com, KATCLAY.com. And same goes for all my social media channels, all under catclay. So please do find me there if you want to chat about TTRPGs and video games. I'm always up for that. But yeah, you can find them there. I've got a new game coming out as well, and working on some Secret Squirrel projects. So please do watch out for those. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you for being here. Awesome to talk to you. And to our listeners, have a good day. See ya.
Thanks, guys. See you later.